May 26, 1940, 11:47 a.m. Dunkirk Harbor, northern France. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay stood in the operations room carved into the white cliffs of Dover, 21 miles across the channel from hell itself. Before him spread a map dotted with red markers, each one a trapped division, a dying battalion, a collapsing perimeter. The numbers told a story of annihilation. 400,000 British and French soldiers pressed against the sea, surrounded on three sides by German armor, with Luftwaffe bombers circling overhead like vultures waiting for the feast. The telephone line to London had been silent for 6 minutes. Ramsay's fingers hovered over a single sheet of paper, a contingency order that would commit every available vessel in southern England to an evacuation attempt that his own staff had calculated at less than 18% probability of success. Around him, officers moved with the careful precision of men trying not to acknowledge the disaster unfolding in real time across the water. Through the narrow window, he could see the smoke rising from Dunkirk, a black column reaching toward the clouds like a funeral pyre for an entire army. He had 15 seconds to decide. Sign the order and risk everything on a plan that defied every principle of naval warfare, or wait for political authorization that might never come, while the greatest military force Britain had ever assembled drowned in the surf or died under German guns. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 14 seconds. 6 days earlier, Captain Marcus Halloway of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, hadn't slept in 38 hours. His unit, what remained of it, was falling back through a landscape that looked like God had taken a hammer to the earth and decided to finish the job with fire. Villages burned in the distance. Overhead, the Stukas came in waves, their sirens designed specifically to trigger the most primal fear centers of the human brain. It was working. Halloway's men were combat-hardened professionals, but even professionals had limits. He could see it in their eyes, the 1,000-yard stare that came not from what they'd seen, but from what they were beginning to understand. They were losing. Not tactically, not temporarily, completely. The German breakthrough at Sedan had been a catastrophe of such magnitude that the Allied command structure had simply ceased to function. 7 Panzer divisions had punched through the Ardennes and were now racing toward the Channel coast at speeds that made a mockery of World War I thinking. The German armored columns moved faster than the orders to stop them could be transmitted. It was like trying to grab smoke. And now the smoke was closing in. Halloway's radio operator, a kid from Manchester named Davies, tuned the wireless with shaking hands. Static crackled. Then a voice, distant and broken. All units, withdrawal to coastal positions. Dunkirk. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Dunkirk wasn't a strategic position. It was a fishing port with a single deep-water harbor and miles of open beach. Retreating there didn't mean regrouping. It meant trapping yourself against the sea with your back to the enemy. "Pack it up," Halloway said quietly. "We move in 5 minutes. Light loads, weapons, ammunition, water. Everything else stays." Around him, 53 men, all that remained of a company that crossed the Channel with 142, began the grim calculus of survival. A private named Thompson held a photograph, wife and daughter from the look of it, then carefully tucked it into his breast pocket. That, apparently, was worth carrying. This was the sound of an army learning it was beaten, and they hadn't even reached Dunkirk yet. Meanwhile, 18 miles from Dunkirk, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, architect of the Panzer breakthrough, stared at a radio message with controlled fury. "Halt order. All Panzer units cease advance. Hold current positions." His forces were 18 miles from encircling the entire British expeditionary force. His tanks had fuel. His men had momentum. The enemy was in complete disarray, and he was being ordered to stop. The decision had come from Hitler himself. The official reasoning was operational. The terrain was too marshy for armor, and Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring had personally guaranteed that his bombers could finish the job without risking Germany's precious Panzer divisions. Guderian knew better. This was politics. Hitler wanted Göring's Luftwaffe to claim the glory. Every hour they waited was an hour the British could use to organize, to dig in, to evacuate, to survive. But orders were orders. In the Wehrmacht, you followed them, even when they were catastrophically stupid. Outside, the German armor sat idle, engines cooling, crews resting, while 18 miles away, the British began to realize they might, just might, have a chance. Back in Dover, Admiral Ramsay's hand still hovered over the evacuation order. 10 seconds. The original plan had been to evacuate perhaps 30,000 men over 2 days. That would leave 370,000 men to die or surrender. Now the goal was 45,000 over 5 days, using every Royal Navy destroyer available. His staff had calculated the mathematics with grim precision. Available deep-water berths in Dunkirk, 3. Loading time per destroyer, 4 to 6 hours. German artillery range, covering the harbor. Luftwaffe sortie rate, 300 plus per day. Even under perfect conditions, they'd be lucky to get 20,000 men off before the harbor became unusable, and conditions were anything but perfect. This wasn't an evacuation, it was a shooting gallery. 6 seconds. Everything in his training told him this was suicide. Naval warfare had rules. You didn't commit capital ships to contested waters without air superiority. You didn't operate in range of shore-based artillery without overwhelming fire support. This broke every rule. But sometimes rules were written for situations where you had choices. And right now, Britain didn't have choices. 2 seconds. Admiral Bertram Ramsay signed his name to Operation Dynamo at exactly 11:47 and 15 seconds Greenwich Mean Time, May 26, 1940. The order was transmitted immediately. All available vessels were to proceed to Dunkirk for evacuation operations, effective immediately. Get me every ship, boat, yacht, fishing vessel, and floating piece of wood between here and Land's End. If it floats and can cross the channel, I want it at Dunkirk by tomorrow morning. The telephone rang. London finally calling back. Churchill's voice came through, gravelly and exhausted. Bertram, tell me you haven't done something monumentally stupid. I've committed every available vessel to an evacuation operation that violates every principle of sound naval warfare, Prime Minister. A pause. Then, good. How many can you save? I have no idea. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 days. Godspeed, Admiral. And from London, a message began spreading through every small port in southern England like wildfire. If you have a boat and can reach Dunkirk, you're needed. May 27, 1940, 4:20 a.m. Captain Halloway's boots hit the wooden planking of the East Mole, a narrow breakwater that stretched nearly a mile out into the harbor. Behind him, his battalion was strung out along the beach. Ahead, a Royal Navy destroyer sat low in the water, already packed with soldiers, but somehow finding room for more. The scene was controlled chaos painted in darkness and urgency. Officers shouted orders. Men moved in files along the mole, 50 yards between groups to minimize casualties of a bomb hit. In the harbor, the water burned, oil mixing with seawater and igniting in patches that cast dancing shadows across the evacuation. The Germans hadn't arrived yet, but they were close. You could hear the artillery getting closer. The boarding process was brutally efficient. Sailors grabbed soldiers by the arms and hauled them over the rail like cargo. The destroyer was packed beyond any reasonable capacity, 900 men where normally 200 served. This wasn't a warship anymore. This was a lifeboat, armed and desperate. At 0500, on schedule, the destroyer pulled away from the mole. Behind them, thousands more men waited their turn. And across the channel, Admiral Ramsay was discovering that his calculated 20,000-man best-case estimate might have been pessimistic. The British people were coming. The flotilla that crossed the channel looked like something from a nautical fever dream. Royal Navy destroyers steamed alongside fishing trawlers, merchant freighters shared space with private yachts, paddle steamers churned toward France loaded with soldiers. Someone had even sent a fireboat from London. If it floated, it was heading to Dunkirk. The call had gone out. Boat owners, fishermen, ferry captains, anyone with a vessel capable of making the crossing, you're needed. And they came. The civilian vessels, dubbed the little ships, couldn't reach the deep-water harbor, but they didn't need to. Soldiers waded into the surf, sometimes neck-deep in freezing water. Small boats packed them aboard until they nearly swamped, then everyone turned around and did it again. No plan had called for this. No military doctrine covered it. It shouldn't have worked. But hour by hour, day by day, the mathematics of disaster slowly began to shift. The Luftwaffe came. Stukas screamed down on the beaches. Bombs churned the surf into geysers of sand and blood. Men died waiting in orderly queues that stretched into the water. But the queues reformed, the boats kept coming, and slowly, impossibly, soldiers who'd expected to die began to believe they might survive.
May 31st, 1940. Admiral Ramsay stood on the dock as HMS Malcolm limped into port with 3 feet of her bow missing. The numbers were starting to come in, and they made no sense. Total evacuated so far, 194,620 men. Ramsay stared at the figures like they were written in a foreign language. His best-case estimate had been 45,000 over 5 days. They'd evacuated 4 times that number, and they weren't finished yet. But German armor had broken through at Newport. They had 12 to 18 hours before the perimeter failed completely. 210,000 men still waited. Send to all vessels maximum emergency evacuation procedures. Pack them in until the boats won't float. We're getting everyone off, or we're dying trying. June 1st, 1940, 11:40 p.m., Dunkirk Beach. Captain Holloway stood in water up to his chest. Around them, the last boats were loading. The German army was less than 2 miles away. You could hear their tanks. A small motor launch pulled alongside. Holloway counted the men around him. 43. The boat could maybe hold 20. Wounded first, he ordered, then youngest. The boat filled. 20 men, then 25, then 30. That's it, the pilot shouted. We're swamping. Holloway looked at the 13 men remaining, including himself. Behind them, German machine gun fire was now audible. Go, he told the pilot. We'll find another way. There is no next one, mate. We're the last. The boat pulled away. 13 men stood in the surf of Dunkirk Beach, watching their last chance at survival disappear into the smoke. Then Davies pointed. Sir, look! From the smoke, another boat appeared, then another. Small craft, fishing boats that should have gone home hours ago, but had turned around for one more run because someone had told them there might be men left behind. Just ordinary people who decided that if there was even a chance someone was still waiting, they'd make another trip. The boats pulled up to the beach. Holloway and his men climbed aboard. Thought you might need a ride, the pilot said. He was maybe 60, a fisherman from Devon who'd been making this run for 3 days straight. Why did you come back? Holloway asked. The old man looked at him like the question was stupid. Because you were still here, weren't you? The boat turned and headed toward England. Behind them, Dunkirk burned, and in Dover, Admiral Ramsay was receiving the final count. 338,226 soldiers evacuated. From an operation where the goal had been 30,000 to 45,000, from a situation where defeat was certain, from a trap that should have destroyed Britain's army and ended the war before it truly began. June 4th, 1940. Winston Churchill stood before Parliament, his face grave, his words measured. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, but there was a victory inside this deliverance which should be noted. He paused. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder, because they had the army to back up those words now. Not because the plan had worked, but because Admiral Ramsay had signed an order in 15 seconds without waiting for permission, and ordinary people with boats had decided that impossible was just another word for "we'll try anyway." Operation Dynamo was expected to evacuate 30,000 to 45,000 men before Dunkirk fell. Instead, 338,226 British and French soldiers were rescued between May 26 and June 4, 1940. 9 British destroyers were lost, over 200 vessels were sunk or damaged, but Britain kept its army, and with it the ability to continue fighting. The myth persists that Dunkirk was a miracle, divine intervention, or impossible luck. It wasn't. It was a 15-second decision made by a man who understood that sometimes leadership means risking everything on plans that shouldn't work, and the courage of thousands who followed him into the impossible.